Hello, and welcome to today's virtual webinar on the role of gender equality and girls' education in times of COVID-19. We are Mariam and Naval Rahman, your moderators for today's session. We are the co-founders of our nonprofit, The World of M&R and Education Transformers at the UN Girls Education Initiative. This is what we call the back to school season, but for most students around the world, this season looks very different this year. According to UNESCO, almost 1.1 billion learners are still affected by the coronavirus pandemic. During its peak, school closures from COVID-19 put nearly 1.6 billion children out of school, including 767 million girls. From gender-based violence to forced marriage and early pregnancy, girls face heightened challenges when schools are closed, and more than 20 million girls may never return to the classroom. The pandemic risks wasting untold human potential and could undermine decades of progress. To ensure that every child has access to 12 years of public education, all stakeholders need to come together to keep education a top priority and strengthen education systems so that the most vulnerable children are not left behind. Today's virtual webinar brings together youth advocates and high-level political leaders to discuss gender equality and girls' education as a crucial aspect of the COVID-19 response and recovery, and to shine a spotlight on education investments for intergenerational and innovative approaches to keep girls learning. Let us start by introducing our participants. Today, we're happy to be joined by Rasmus Prehn, the Minister for Development Cooperation in Denmark, Minister David Munina Sangay, the Minister of Basic and Senior Secondary Education in Sierra Leone, Axel Jacobsen, the State Secretary of International Development at the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ms. Alice Albright, the CEO of the Global Partnership for Education, Sonita Alizadeh, who is a rapper from Afghanistan and Girls Not Brides champion, Ayat Chebi, the African Union Youth Envoy, and Mohammed Sidibe, a peace activist and GPE youth champion. As we have many excellent speakers in this webinar, each of our first four panelists will have 2 minutes to provide their opening remarks. We'd like to start with you, Minister Prehn. Thank you for participating in today's event. And we'd like to thank Denmark as well, which has been a strong political advocate for girls' education and helping developing countries fight against coronavirus. Minister Prehn, you now have the floor to provide your opening remarks.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure it is to be in this very important meeting. First of all, thank you for this very lively and engaged introduction. It's really an important topic we have to discuss today, so I have been looking very much forward to be a part of this. Thank you to Global Partnership for Education to arranging this webinar, and thank you to all the participants to stay tuned on this very important debate. There's no doubt that when we have school closures, it have an enormous impact. And it's not only the school itself, which can be, of course, a big problem, but it's also lots of other problems. For many kids, they don't receive the free meal they have every day. And for many, especially girl students, it's a problem that when they leave school, they are at risk, a very grave risk, for violence, rapes, early marriage, and lots of other problems. So we have to be very concerned, and we are very concerned from the Danish state, and we try our utmost to help and build up new opportunities. So it's the main target is to get girls and boys back to school as soon as possible, but also to have a lot of helping programs. And I'm proud as Danish Minister for Development Cooperation to have freed up new money to support people in the most vulnerable settings due to the corona crisis, and that we have also front-loaded money to Global Partnership for Education and others, because it's really necessary to support schools and support the work for gender equality and especially girls' rights out there in the field. So I'm very pleased to be part of this debate, and I'm looking so much forward to your questions and to integrate in this very important debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We'd also like to thank Minister Sangay for joining this conversation. And for your country, Sierra Leone, COVID-19 is the second health crisis with a massive impact on the economy and education sector within a few years. So we'd like to pass the floor on to you, Minister Sangay, to provide your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. And thank you for such a wonderful panel. I'm here to learn in as much as I'm here to contribute. I think, as you definitely said, Sierra Leone is in a space where we've had closures. And, as you were saying, this is not our second. We've had lots of school closures in 97. When there was a coup, schools were closed for a long period of time. And then, as you rightly mentioned, during the Ebola crisis, schools were closed as well for about a year. And now schools have been closed for many months. And we've used every of those challenges to really modify and change what we do in our response. And for us, we were able to look back and note that about between 10 to 14,000 girls got pregnant before, and there was a ban on pregnant girls coming back to school. And before we even closed schools, we overturned that ban by cabinet. And during COVID, we ensured that the education radio had sexual and reproductive health, gender-based violence on the education radio. We ensured that we went on a in-person community visits. I went across the country with my team, and we had a zero schoolgirl pregnancy campaign. And now, just last week, I was out in Moyamba as well, where we're having a campaign to have those girls come back to school. We focused on data, we understood, and just based on, so we keep track of all the girls who returned back to school and who were taking the exams were pregnant, which is something that we didn't do before. Now we're very intentional within the ministry in terms of disaggregated data, because you can only solve gender problems if you have the data actually. And we're using the data-focused approach. And one thing that I'd like to end on and open up to the debate is we're also developing our policies. And today, Alice and I collaborated on an article about radical inclusion. And radical inclusion means that we'll stop at nothing. We'll change the regulation. We'll put the infrastructure. We'll remove every barrier such that everybody, and in particular girls, can go to access and stay in school. And this is important because when exams were happening, for example, if a girl is pregnant, you don't put them in the middle of the exam hall because you have to use the toilet after. You put them by the door so that they can go and use the restroom when they need to use it without disrupting everybody. It's interventions like that that we want to promote throughout the school. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And our next speaker is Ms. Alice Albright, the CEO of the Global Partnership for Education. GPE has been actively helping developing countries ensure that children are continuing to learn while schools are closed due to COVID-19. And they have mobilized more than $500 million to support other countries with planning and implementing their response to the pandemic. And so, Ms. Albright, we'd now like to pass the floor over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Let me just make sure everybody can hear me because there was some echoing. Okay, very good. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be here with everybody. I think that in moments like this, we have to do everything we can to connect with one another, even if virtually. So it's a great pleasure to see many friends. Of course, Minister Senge, Minister Prem, State Secretary Jacobson, and all of the advocates that are with us. So it's just wonderful to be together. So Mariam and Nival have already quoted the numbers. I mean, at its height, COVID resulted in about 1.6 billion learners globally being out of school. Now, of course, those numbers have begun to come down a little bit, but we still see significant numbers of children out of school as a result of the pandemic. And of course, many, many hundreds of millions of those are girls. In general, the pandemic will have obviously a number of significant impacts on education. As schools, in many cases, are lifelines to communities, to children through nutrition, through health, but also through education. And of course, they're closed, so that lifeline is severed. And girls are particularly impacted. I think that some of the examples that Minister Senge gave were very illustrative of some of the issues that in particular can face girls in the middle of the pandemic. So we're, of course, very concerned about all of this. GPE responded very quickly. Late in March, we put together, working closely with our board and our partners, a little over $500 million in funding that has now been largely deployed to country partners. We've deployed already in the country-facing grants about $430 million of funding to 54 countries. In general, countries will use that money on 4 different things. One is to enhance distance learning. Minister Senge has talked about radio. That's an example. The other is to help schools reopen safely when they're able to. The third is to reach out to, in particular, remote populations and girls to give them the resources to get back to school. And then also to build in resilience into education systems. And so the money has been targeted specifically to help countries contend with the COVID-related impacts on education. We know that when schools close, girls are hit hard. There's teenage pregnancy, there's violence, there's gender-based violence, there's more early marriage, and so we're particularly concerned about that. Our grants are also helping reach beyond the narrow education to look at some of the harmful practices and social norms, unfortunately, that we see when schools are closed. Many of you know how GPE works. We're not a prescriptive organization. We very much want countries to take the lead in designing how they respond to crises. So the country partners that we've worked with come up with, I think, some excellent programming ideas about how to work. Just to give you a couple of examples, in the Republic of the Congo, girls, they worked very much on campaigning to get girls back into school. In Mozambique, the government is making sure that there's proper sanitation and hygiene facilities. Rwanda has been working on using its telecommunications network to get programming out. And there's many, many other incredibly creative examples of how countries have used the assets that they have to keep education going. And of course, there's lots of information on our website about this. So these are just a few examples. Just in sum, I think the big picture, I think it's important to remember a few things. We've seen over the past few months, not just in the developing countries, but globally, how vulnerable education is to crisis. And I think it's a sector that in some parts of the world, one can take for granted, but we can't take it for granted because we can see in a matter of days how it can be taken away. And then you see the value of why education is so important. Quick response is very, very necessary. I was very proud that GPE was able to move so much money so quickly into our country partners. We will have to then begin to take a look to make sure that it's had the right impact. But the feedback that we've got on our quick response has been very, very positive to keep education going, to reach the most marginalized and worry on some of those parts of society that are most heavily impacted. And I think as a final point, I think there's some things we can learn going forward. I think that what COVID has done has been incredibly eye-opening in terms of how vulnerable education is, but it has also opened the door of how we can begin to deliver education better. And this is at the heart of GPE's new strategic plan. It's all about transforming education. And as Minister Senge knows, we've worked very hard at GPE to listen very closely to our country partners about what they want. They want innovation, they want scale, they want transformation, and they want better delivery of education. And GPE, as a partnership, the largest partnership, is right there trying to help out. So thank you very much to everybody, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the conversation. Thank you. I'll put myself back on mute.
Thank you so much. And thank you to State Secretary Jacobson for also being part of this webinar. As someone who has worked in the health sector for many years, you are well familiar with the impact a pandemic can have on the lives of people. But in your current role, you're also very busy in terms of providing cross-sectoral solutions. So we'd like to pass the floor on to you now to provide your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to take part in this webinar and to listen to and get the input from all the excellent participants and panelists. So thank you. We all know that the world is facing an educational crisis without precedent at the moment. Schools worldwide closed down as countries implemented measures against the pandemic. And in many countries, schools remain closed today. Some 23.8 million additional children and youth may drop out or not have access to school next year. This means that not only do millions of students worldwide not receive the education they have the right to, it also means that there are many students receiving one less meal per day. In addition, it means that many cannot access the safe space that schools provide. And the most vulnerable students become more vulnerable. Experiences from previous crises tells us that girls are at particular risk in crisis, even more so when schools close. They are at increased risk of sexual violence, forced marriages, early pregnancies, and different forms of forced labor. And for this reason, we also know that girls, once taken out of school, are more likely not to return to school. This is a serious challenge to the positive developments made in the past decades towards quality education for all and for all girls. Friends, this is something that we cannot allow to happen, and Norway will continue its long-standing support for education for all, including girls and vulnerable groups, with the aim that no one should be left behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we'd like to get the perspectives of some of our youth participants as well. So before we begin, let's listen to a song from Sunita Alizadeh, a rapper from Afghanistan and champion for Girls Not Brides. Sunita uses her rap lyrics and voice to help end child marriage and inspire people everywhere to dream bigger dreams. And so Sunita, before we play this video, the song is called Brides for Sale. Could you please briefly explain the message around the song?
First of all, hi to everyone, and I'm so glad to be among you. It feels good to be active again, even though it's virtual. But anyway, so this song is called Brides for Sale, and I wrote it when I almost escaped child marriage. So in the actual video, you'll see me in a wedding dress, rapping, and with bruises on my face. So that story comes from my friends. In my classroom, when I was in Iran, I had a few friends that were with bruises all the time that they were in school, and because of fighting child marriage. So this story talks about how it feels to be forced into marriage, how it feels to leave school, to leave your dreams, to leave your childhood, and to live with someone who you don't like you don't even know that person, and you have to be stuck with that person forever without even having the second chance to think about what your previous dreams were. So this is a song that talks about child marriage, and it actually feels that girls are always forced into marriages, like they don't even being given the second choice to choose who to marry, who to live with. So it's basically my story, but it's actually the story of a million girls around the world.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and we're really excited to see the video next.
فریاد به جای اون سکوت یک زن، فریاد به جای اون زخمای تن، فریاد جسمی که تقفز قصه شد، زیر فشار قیمتاش ما شکسته شد. من 15 سالنه از شهر هراتون، چند نفر اومدن خواسته گری میگین جمعاتون از یادمون رسم ازدواج و سر با پول میفروشن بدون حتم انتخاب. مال بحث پدرم خارج آبنونه، هر کی پول بیشتر بده دختر مال اونه. اگه میفهمیدون به خارج به کتاب میکنی، اگه میفهمیدون نقمه ها حساب میکنی، با شکم برو ساعت صفر برمیگی شد، یا که تمونده غذا شمار برمیده شد. من مثل کل دخترام من تخمونه بندیم، از چشم خانواده اومدون گسفند لندیم، گردن تاکید میکنن که وقت گورش منه. من هم آدمون به خدایی هم چشم گوش منه. کجا دیدیم گسفند از کشه خوشاکی باشه، کجا دیدیم گسفند اینقدر احساساتی باشه. من به خدا نمیتونم از شما دور باشم، هیچ وقت شما نمیفروشم حتی مجبور باشم. ولی شما از چی بگم، میفهمم بر به دنیا آوردیم بابت چی بودم. بذارین داد بزن و من سکوت قصه شدم، دستا خوب بردارم که حرف بزن و خفه شدم. اونقدر با من حرف نزدین که محل هسته، مجبورم به سر و خود چک کنم که قابل لمسه. این گسته دانه دارم وجود نپور شهر که اگه زنده نیم چهره رد نشه لغا حقی. میفهمم رسن شهر شما یه دختر ساکت چه بگم چه کار کنم تا وجود مثابت شه. شاید برای خودکشی اصل حماقته، آدم چاره ای نداره وقتی بی حمایته. اما تار موهامرم که کنده باشه، این کار نمیکنم که طرف کنده باشه. اگه فروش میبره شما جای خوشحالیه، سعی کنم دروغ بگم همه چی عالیه. من که از خدا من لبخند باشه بلا باشم، اگه لبخند دارم شما مروشه گوش بفهمه نگفته زن بره فروشه شما شاد باشیم به محتاج به آرامشو مرتن ها بگذاریم بیزار از آرایشو صورتی که بوده ایجارایشی درمون نمیکنه کاری که شما کردیم کافر با مسلمون نمیکنه به خود زجاوره بری و بی احساسی در آغوشی کسی بری که اون نمیشناسی دیگه ادامه دادن حرفان به سختیه بریم خوشی شما نهایت خوشبختیه اما به من نگاه کن چهرم از یاد نبر کسی که با قرص آب بالا شما بود تا سحر به میرون و از یاد بشه ما دست برم اما نگرانم شما دست کی بسپارم به میرون اگه دلتنگ مشو دل شما هر سخون نمیبارم میگذارم بره شما نگذاری او هم مثل مشکای جاری باشه با ایشانو نفروشی بذار یادگاری باشه
Thank you, Sunita, for that amazing performance. That's a very powerful message. So thank you again for sharing that with us. And now let's get into your question. So COVID-19 is exacerbating inequalities already faced by vulnerable populations, and particularly adolescent girls. And school closures and economic hardships are having unintended consequences for girls, as we saw with the Ebola virus as well. So how can donors and the education community step up to protect adolescent girls from violence and exploitation, and particularly the increasing risks of early/forced marriage?
A really good question. So we're talking about girls getting back to school. We also need to know that there are so many girls that are out of school right now, no matter when, before or after the pandemic. So in my opinion, no matter how much time, energy, money, donors, and educational community invest in the development of adolescent girls, they will still have a chance to experience forced marriage, early marriages. So I believe that if they want to fix the problem, they have to solve the root of the problem. What is the root of the problem? It is the fact that there is no spotlight on the parents. If we think about it, the first place that we learn about justice, injustice, equality, inequality, it is not in a classroom. It is not outside. It is inside our home. So parents are the initial teachers. So for the donors, the way that they can help, it is the way that can support girls actually, it is to first help their parents to have a better and the right definition of human rights, to know that how harmful, how painful it is, this practice, not only for girls, but also for the entire community, which is keeping the community in a cycle of poverty. Today, fortunately, we have many young people who know their full potential, who know that they can become whoever, at least close to whoever they dreamt of becoming. But if the parents see no other possibilities for them, this destination can be changed. If parents are not educated that what is right, what is wrong, they might change the entire future of that child, of that girl, of that boy. So I hope that donors and educational community support the NGOs that are investing in educating parents, because this is how real, lasting, and positive changes can be made, in my opinion.
Thank you so much, Sunita, and those are really great points as well. Now we're moving on to our next youth activist. We have Aya Chebi. She's an award-winning Pan-African feminist and the founder of Africa Youth Movement, one of Africa's largest Pan-African youth-led movements. And she currently serves as the first African Union Youth Envoy and the youngest diplomat at the African Union Commission Chairperson's Cabinet. And so our question for Aya is that as the African Union Youth Envoy, you're in constant contact with youth from across the continent. So how are African youth stepping up to co-lead Africa's response to COVID-19? So youth-led solutions, innovations, and campaigns. And what role does education play in equipping young people to respond to crises and build a resilience?
Thank you so much for having me here. It's great to see 3 ministers committed for this girls' education, and also brave people like Sonita. Thank you for sharing your story with us, my sister. On the question, indeed, African youth have showing unprecedented leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic, despite the fact that we are the most affected economically by the crisis. Many of these young people lost their jobs and livelihoods. Their education is disrupted. They have mental drain and hardships from the lockdowns, and yet African youth have put their energy in the fight to end the pandemic, even though we don't see them on the headlines being recognized and appreciated for their resilience and innovation. So we convened about 22 youth consultation on COVID-19 between March and June with 22,000 youth, and we had the opportunity to listen to young people sharing how they're combating the spread of misinformation and fake news. They're initiating awareness campaigns for hand washing. Some of them turned their organization offices into labs to produce hand sensitizers. We saw also artists creating informational songs. We saw tech gurus developing applications for response and prevention. And just to give a few examples, in South Sudan, young peace builders run a campaign called Ana Taban, raising awareness on COVID-19 education and peace, using their artistic skill, graffiti, poetry, drama. In Sahrawi Republic, youth-led platforms raising awareness about refugee needs in Algeria, and especially on education. We also saw Tiwale in Malawi empowering young women around creative fashion and using the opportunity of producing masks, for example, to get financial support. I can go on and on. Africa Education Initiative in Chad, and Somalia in Egypt, Savievu in Morocco, and the list really goes on. And we tried as well at the African Union to amplify these voices. We published a Sauti blog at the African Union to amplify 25 young women's stories and their innovation in COVID-19. But honestly, we still can give justice to all the youth voices because thousands of young Africans are on the front line. But on the role of education and resilience, in many ways, I think education helped those who had the knowledge and skill set to adapt to the outbreak and especially turn their businesses, for example, to online opportunities. And it's been a learning for us in Africa as well, I think, now to ensure greater readiness of future potential crises and improve, as Minister Sange said, radical, inclusive, and quality education for all girls and boys. But I also think it's really imperative that young people become integral part of their government's response and national plans in producing these policies and national budgets on COVID-19. And this also include young scientists and professionals who should be part of the scientific conversation also in developing the vaccine moving forward. So there is a lot of ways on how young people can be involved, and they should be involved. It's not an option or a choice, it's a must.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Aya. And it's really great to hear the work that young people are already doing, and then also the potential for them to get involved in the future again. So thank you so much. And next, we want to talk with Mohammed Sidibe, a youth activist and GPE youth champion. As a former child soldier, current law school student, and youth activist, how do you see the role of education in creating empowered citizens, including in emergency situations? And how does ensuring access to quality education for boys and girls affect sustained peace and long-term development?
The old adage that young people are the future of tomorrow, it's often said at the expense of the giant contributions the youth are currently making in the present. In 2002, right after the war ended, I remember meeting this charismatic young man named Chernobog, in a country coming out of a civil war that had physically and mentally scarred every citizen who experienced it. Chudner was determined to get the country to include young people's voices in the ensuing peace process. Back then, I couldn't fully grasp the significance of what this teenager was trying to accomplish. How would I? I was 10 years old. I'd never seen the inside of a classroom, and I'd already spent the last 4 years of my life as a child soldier. My view of the world was limited to my experience, which was filled with fear, pain, and despair. As such, I felt that that was all that the world had to offer. Quality education that I subsequently received played a big part in expanding my worldview. Julius Nyerere, the father of modern-day Tanzania, once said that education is not a way to escape poverty, it is a way of fighting it. At 27 years old, with my education that would soon include a Juris Doctorate and a Master's in Law, I'm nearly guaranteed to not be stuck in the cycle of poverty that I was destined for coming out of being a child soldier at the end of the Civil War. Publicly, we, as a collection of societies, have all agreed, much like food and water, that education is a right. But silently, we have determined education appropriate to be distributed as a privilege. Partially due to this latest pandemic, we now have a world where almost 1 billion children are deprived of the right to their education. Indeed, democracy is not a one-size-fits-all. But for democracy to truly function as we imagine it, the government's role is to ensure that its people receive a quality education without any exception. A quality education is a gateway to having engaged citizens politically and socially. But more than that, education is the most important tool that can be used to harness potential, maximize productivity, and fight poverty. And it's a fallacy, a dangerous one at that, to think that a country can fight poverty without the tool that is quality education. So if we're serious about this idea of sustained peace and long-term development, we better reimagine how we fund education and go from this failed half-in, half-out method to an all-in approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Absolutely, and we definitely agree with your points as well. And next, we wanted to allow our youth participants to ask a few questions to our political leaders. And so I'll pass the floor to Aya Chebi to start us off.
Thank you so much. I want to maybe start with Minister Pren, and I want to ask, Denmark has been an active proponent of gender transformative approach. Can you maybe elaborate what you mean by that and what role does education play in that regard? Minister, over to you.
Thank you so much, Aya Chebi, for asking this very important question. I think what we have realized in Denmark is that we have been so much richer and so much more talented with involving our females in the society to have gender equality. I think one of the reasons that Denmark has such a good economy, so great deal of happiness and prosperity is because we are one of the most equal societies. And that is one of the reasons that we have decided that this fight for freedom, this fight for equality is so important. So we would like also to inspire others, because we really believe we will have much better societies where both genders are represented, are bringing in and to participate in the society. And what we can see is having this focus in our education, we can actually empower young girls and women to set themselves free, to have the power to go after education rather than to stick to traditions. And I think Sunita's points before, saying that it's also important to talk with the parents, is very crucial. And that is one of the reasons that every time we have partnerships with partner countries, we try to inspire the whole country to think about fighting the inequality, and to try to convincing the parents that you will have a much more happy child if the child is allowed to take education rather than to be forced into fixed marriage. And we are also trying to working with the structures in the society, so no one should be forced for economical reasons into this old traditions. So we try to inspire the model of totally equality between genders, and we really think that's the way forward to have much more happy and prosperous societies.
So, Minister, you are a feminist.
I'm indeed a feminist, and I think it's really important for the future society that countries with good experiences on gender equality, that we do our utmost to push back the more conservative powers in the world, trying to push back the right for sexual information, the right for family planning, the right to contraceptives, and all that. We have to fight that fight and insist that every human being should be able to decide themselves and to realize the potential and have the education they want. And in that perspective, it's very crucial for every woman to decide themselves how many, with whom, and when they should be giving birth to a child. That's really the center of that discussion, because if girls and women are forced into be mothers too early, they don't have the chance to get the education they need, and they should decide more for themselves. And I think they will also be much better parents when they have the opportunity to decide for themselves.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you for answering from your values, because I think everyone in leadership should be driven by their values. And it's important that ministers like you who are fighting for girls' education are feminists and they are driven by gender equality. So thank you for that.
Thank you both so much, Aya and Minister Pren. And now we'd like to pass it over to Sonita.
Thank you. So my question is for Ms. Albright. COVID-19 is not only impacting the health sector. What does a holistic response look like, considering the important links between education, health, and hygiene, which are all of particular importance for gender equality?
Thank you, Sunita, for the question, and you're absolutely right. The way to think about it is when you think about the role that schools have in communities, they are places where children get school meals. They are places where girls need to have adequate facilities for hygiene, and there are multiple dimensions to the problem. So in order, I think, to have an effective response, we have to go at it in a holistic way. And so we have to think about nutrition, we have to think about hygiene, we do have to think about health and some of the health challenges that are present that will get in the way of schools reopening. One of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about is getting, when the vaccines are available, how do we get those out to teachers and other protective equipment to enable schools to reopen? So the solutions do have to be, I think, widely considered and realize that the sectors very much sort of need to work together. I think the other dimension that is holistic, and we've talked about it a little bit on this phone call, is the multiple types of barriers facing girls. There are capacity barriers, there are societal barriers. You've spoken very eloquently about those in terms of early marriage, for example, on the call. There are also COVID is going to exacerbate the barriers for girls getting back to school in terms of sort of the income aspect of it, but also there's not enough hygiene facilities, there's not enough capacity, there are not enough trained teachers. So COVID is going to exacerbate all of that. So I think if we're going to be successful here, we have to work across sectors, but then we also have to realize that the solutions that are necessary for girls in particular are going to have to be multidimensional.
Thank you both so much. And now, Mohammed, over to you.
Thank you. My question is for Minister Senge. Not too long ago, you were a youth activist like me. Now you are an aspiring political leader and the Minister of Education. How can we ensure that there will also be more female leaders? And what role does girls' education play in this regard? Thank you.
I am still an activist, and I think it's important. I think we can have activists in government, and this is. I have friends who feel like because I'm in government now that I'm suddenly not an activist. I do get to engage with these decisions from a different point of view, and for those of us who have been an activist and who are not activists anymore actively, we're allies, and it's important that I think to your point, some of that we have to do and lead by example. So I'm also the Chief Innovation Officer. Half of my leadership team is female, and I go out all of the way and ensure that my data scientists are equally represented as female. I just completed the hiring of a delivery team at Ministry of Education. All of them are female. The policy lead. And it's not because I'm choosing for females, it's that they're just the best candidates who are coming out. And I am not trying to actively ask for men in these conversations. So the question and conversation about it is we have to model it. You have my head of delivery is a female, the policy, the data people are all female. And it's important that we're delivering in terms of outputs. Nobody's questioning what the ministry is doing in outputs. And we have to keep having those examples. And we have a lot of female allies. In my trip recently, I brought along, she actually came and I was like, thank you for coming. This lady, Asma James, who's a leading voice and activist in the country. She has a group called Girls Plus, and she came along to talk to girls. We have to never stop advocating for girls at the table. And final comment was, we have, anyway, so two things. There's a lady, the first female cabinet minister in West Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, was Sierra Leonean. Elakolo Glama. In my office, I have a big portrait of her. And everybody who comes to my office has to ask, oh, who's the painter? It's like, that's Elakolo Glama. She's the first parliamentarian, first minister, and it's important for all of us. But my final point was somebody on my team today, and I always use my team as an example, sent an image for a poster that we're going to use about exam malpractice. And it was a girl that was doing the exam malpractice, and I responded immediately, no, I do not want the girl being the example of the one who's cheating, because it's just these subtle things. Like, it doesn't have to be the girl. It can be some boy or a genderless figure. But we have to demonstrate this through everything that we do. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. And now for our last youth participant question, we'd like to pass it back to Aya.
Thank you so much. So my question is for State Secretary Jacobson. The big demand for initiatives like GP's COVID-19 response has really revealed a massive additional need in Africa and other regions of the world. What does this really mean for Norway as a leading partner in international development? And what is your message to other donor countries in general in times of a global pandemic? Your mic, Minister.
Thank you, Aya. The experience with the pandemic clearly illustrates the importance of partnerships such as the Global Partnership for Education, and also Education Cannot Wait. They are essential for supporting education systems worldwide. And there is a need to support also distance learning, but also to prepare for the return to school with stronger, more resilient education system that cater for the students' needs in order to ensure students do not miss out on their education. And COVID-19 has demonstrated a potential to all of us for innovation and creativity. And we encourage efforts to make digital and alternative teaching methods, such as digital learning and online or radio and TV instructions. At the same time, we recognize that the most vulnerable may not always benefit from distance education. And we encourage partners and colleagues to continue their efforts to improving the access to inclusive education for all, also in times like these. And when it comes to GPE and to upcoming replenishment of the global partnership, I think the GPE's results are the best argument. I'm convinced that GPE delivers on the ground if donors deliver at the replenishment, because there are no better investment than investing in the hope and possibilities of young people. So finally, I will encourage continued domestic finance for education and for donors to focus on the least developed countries and the most vulnerable children. These are the ones that are most on risk and should be highest on our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we'd like to ask some questions that the public asked us to address in this discussion from Twitter. And our first question is that COVID-19 has caused many people to lose their jobs and students to be out of school as well. So it risks further exacerbating existing inequalities. And what needs to be done to ensure that the most vulnerable are not left behind? And State Secretary Jacobson, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. That is a great question. And this is a core issue. As I mentioned, the pandemic is much more than a health emergency. Education is the backbone of development for the individual and for our country. And this is why we emphasize the importance of education at all times. Education for all is a key element to a safe future. And it's a key element to resilient societies and to reduce the difference between the rich and the poor, both nationally and in our global community. And I think cooperation is central to ensure that the most vulnerable are not left behind. Cooperation between countries, with communities and civil society is important, and it's an important measure to ensure that the disruption of education services is mitigated and its negative impacts reduced. Inclusive and accessible alternative teaching methods where a safe return to school is not possible, and then strengthening school system and targeted efforts to reach those most that will not return to school are all measures that we need to take now.
Absolutely. And Minister Prine, we'd love to hear from you next on the same question.
Thank you so much. Very important question. To be honest, I'm very aligned with my good friend and colleague in Norway, State Secretary Jacobsen. A very crucial point from him and Norway. What we would like to say from the Danish side is that it's very important with a whole of society approach, and that we try to see how can we identify the opportunities in the problems rather than the problems in the opportunities. And therefore we have this vision that we have tried to inspire other countries with, to go in and what we say, build back better and greener. So using this crisis to build up new jobs in a green way, and also using those initiatives to create, for instance, vocational training. And in that way, inspire new hope, new opportunities in the countries. On the more concrete level, we have been involved with, for instance, Niger, and we have worked together with the World Banks in an effort to protect jobs and livelihoods, also for families, and that's really crucial. Also to have the opportunity to live as family and have the resources also to send their kids into school. And then, of course, when it comes to schools, to do our utmost to secure the opportunity to return to schools and to build up that opportunity to again and to educate in those difficult situations, also with schools on distance.
Definitely. Thank you both so much for answering that question. And our next question from the public is that 21st century skills require digital skills, but many students around the world still lack home computers and internet connectivity. So how can governments ensure that students are prepared to join the workforce in the future? And Aya, what are your thoughts on this question?
Thank you for that question. I'm really glad we are touching on this topic before we close, because this is literally one of the major barriers to education and skill development in Africa. In early May, the African Union established the African Youth Front on coronavirus. Those are like 18 networks working on continental response. And they recently run a survey, and one of the top challenges for African youth during the pandemic has been the digital divide. And yet no one is working on closing this divide, neither in the advocacy policy space or in the private-public kind of partnership. So we can talk about digital transformation and as innovative force, but digital also for Africa is privileged closed space. And I really think it's unfair for Africa to be out of the digital revolution in 2020, with 70% of Africa being offline. So even with those platforms, we're only reaching 30% of the population. And I think girls are most affected by this, because more likely girls than boys would have a phone, let alone a smartphone that can have access, and that's shown by statistics. So I think we really, if we want to talk about e-learning, we need to talk about digital transformation. The future is digital, and the future of jobs is digital. So government should take serious action to invest in the infrastructure and really crash the internet prices, and at the same time make sure girls are not victims of this digital divide. So we shouldn't be widening the learning inequality because of that. I really hope COVID-19 is a wake-up call on the digital divide, and that countries like Norway and Denmark will take action on it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And for our final speaker, we'd like to ask Minister Senge if you have anything to add to this as well.
Yeah, it's such it's so wonderful to hear what Aya was saying, because I completely agree. Firstly, any solution that we have must be hybrid. It has to be online and offline. It has to work on mobile. It has to work on paper. We shouldn't forget that paper is also technology. It has to work on the internet, and there are different ways of having the connectivity and radio. There are still many people who can't access radio, even though radio is there. So I fully agree with her, and I think this is one. But there's work happening. So I know that the digital public goods, for example, and we're looking at connecting schools, and with UNICEF, there's the Giga project between UNICEF and those organizations and ITU and Sierra Leone. We're looking at seeing how we can connect all of our schools. So we shouldn't stop advocating. Let's advocate. And yes, there's a huge digital divide, and that was exacerbated in COVID and became obvious. And girls are the ones who get to suffer. And it really is that we should always think about the people who are off the grid, who are remotest, the young rural female girl. If we solve for the young female rural child, then it will work for everybody else.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. We've reached the end of our discussion, and we would also like to thank GPE for convening this important and timely discussion. As schools around the world closed due to the pandemic, GPE was quick to set up a COVID-19 funding window to allow countries to initiate valuable remote learning programs and prepare for the reopening of schools as well. We would also like to thank all the panelists who were able to join us today. We saw that many partners here are here today and made important political decisions and leveraged valuable networks to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. What we've seen today is the clear importance of ensuring that girls and other vulnerable groups are not left behind when countries build back from the health, economic, and educational setbacks caused by COVID-19. So thank you all so much for joining, and until next time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Stay safe. Stay healthy.